It bothers them because the Americans do not accept under any circumstances that any country in Latin America should have a leading role. They believe that the countries of Latin America must all remain subordinate to the guidance of the US State Department. The United States is actually afraid of losing its primacy as the world's sheriff. In fact, it doesn't want any competitors, not in the economic sphere, not in the technological sphere, nor in the military sphere. The Americans have always interfered in Latin American politics. They were responsible for the coup in Brazil, responsible for the coup in Chile, for the coup in Uruguay, for the coup in Argentina, you know? So yes, it's part of American political culture. And that's what I stood up against, because Brazil is a sovereign country. Brazil has the right to decide its own policies. And that's precisely why we absolutely cannot accept the role that the United States consistently tries to impose upon all of humanity, perpetually wanting to be the world's sole sheriff and global enforcer.
The US government is blatantly meddling in the internal affairs of Brazil, and US President Donald Trump is trying to destabilize Brazil's democratically elected left-wing president Lula da Silva. The Trump White House has officially declared Brazil a threat to US so-called national security, and the US State Department has imposed sanctions on Brazilian government officials, in particular Brazilian judges, which is a blatant form of meddling in Brazil's internal affairs. Trump has also announced a massive 50% tariff on Brazil, which is one of the highest tariff rates that Trump has imposed on any country. So this raises the question, why? What is Trump trying to do? He has two main goals here. One involves international politics, Brazil's foreign policy, and the other involves Brazil's domestic politics. I'll start by explaining the geopolitics of the US government's attacks on Brazil. Brazil has been a leading voice pushing for a more multipolar world, challenging US global hegemony. And in fact, Brazil's left-wing president Lula da Silva, known popularly simply as Lula, he was one of the co-founders of BRICS, the Global South-led organization, back in 2009. And in the 16 years since, BRICS has expanded significantly. The Global South-led organization now has 10 member countries and 10 partner countries, and together they represent 56% of the world population and 44% of the global economy when you measure their GDP at purchasing power parity, PPP. Under Lula, Brazil has played a key role in pushing to strengthen BRICS and give more power to the global South. These are the countries that were formerly colonized by the Western powers, and they represent the global majority. And under Lula, Brazil has grown closer and closer to China, which is Brazil's largest trading partner, and Brazil has pretty good relations with Russia. And Lula has pushed back against US hegemony. When Trump threatened to impose 50% tariffs on Brazil, Lula said, "The world does not need an emperor. The US is not the global emperor." Now, people in the English-speaking world often don't know a lot about Lula da Silva because he doesn't speak English, so all of his speeches and comments are made in Portuguese. So I used artificial intelligence to translate an interview that Lula did in 2021 with the Chinese media outlet Guancha. And in this clip, you can hear Lula talk about how the US backed this coup against him, and he explained the reasons why. Because Brazil has been pushing for a more multipolar world, to strengthen Latin America as a new pole in this multipolar world, to reform the United Nations Security Council so the US can no longer use its veto power, abuse its veto power to control the United Nations, and how Brazil under Lula was a co-founder of BRICS, how Brazil has become a close partner of China, and how the US empire is trying to impose its imperial hegemony in Latin America. Listen to this clip. It's a bit long, but I think it's important to understand how Brazil's president sees the world, and this will help you understand the larger geopolitical context.
The US Department of Justice, in other words, they guided American prosecutors, participated in my case, came to Brazil to meet with the Brazilian Public Prosecutor's Office. The judge and the prosecutors went to the United States to discuss my conviction with the American prosecutors. We have recorded testimony of American prosecutors celebrating my arrest. The only explanation I can find for this, Eric, is that Brazil was becoming a very important international player. We were fighting for the UN Security Council to have more countries. We were fighting, we built a very strong bloc in South America. We were building the BRICS, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and Russia. We were creating a multilateral organization. In other words, we even considered creating a currency, for commercial transactions, so we wouldn't have to depend on the dollar. We were seeing, for example, Brazil maintaining an extraordinary relationship with China. China became Brazil's #1 trading partner. Just so you have an idea, in my first year as president, the trade flow between Brazil and China was only $6 billion. When I left in 2010, it was already $76 billion. In other words, the commercial relationship between Brazil and China grew 16 times during my term. And China was an extremely important country in its relationship with Brazil, and I think that bothered the Americans. It bothered them because the Americans do not accept, under any circumstances, that any country in Latin America should have a leading role. They believe that the countries of Latin America must all remain subordinate to the guidance of the US State Department. And at the same time, China was making a lot of investments in South America and Latin America. China had a very strong partnership with Brazil, with Argentina, with Venezuela, with Ecuador, in other words. And this bothered the Americans, just as Brazil's entry into the African continent bothers them. And just as China's entry into the African continent bothers them. In other words, the United States is actually afraid of losing its primacy as the world's sheriff. In fact, it doesn't want any competitors, not in the economic sphere, not in the technological sphere, nor in the military sphere. And the concrete fact is that Brazil was growing. Brazil was becoming an international protagonist. China has been growing. And today, it's one of the countries with the highest GDP in the world. The Chinese economy has surpassed the American economy. And now they're worried about, China's progress in terms of armaments, in terms of space exploration. So the Americans get uneasy because they have been used to, since World War I, to being the rulers of the world. So this is the explanation I have for what happened with the coup against President Dilma Rousseff, for what happened with my imprisonment and all the lies told against the PT. Is the only explanation I can find. That's it. The Americans have always interfered in Latin American politics. They were responsible for the coup in Brazil, responsible for the coup in Chile, for the coup in Uruguay, for the coup in Argentina, So yes, it's part of American political culture. And that's what I stood up against, because Brazil is a sovereign country. Brazil has the right to decide its own policies. Brazil has the right to decide its own economy. And Brazil has the right to determine its international relations, just as China also has that right. And that's precisely why we absolutely cannot accept the significant role that the United States consistently tries to impose upon all of humanity, perpetually wanting to be the world's sole sheriff and global enforcer.
This year, 2025, Brazil is the chair of BRICS. The position rotates every year among the different BRICS members. And in July, Lula hosted the BRICS summit in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. And the summit was very successful. This was the first ever BRICS meeting featuring the 10 new partner countries. And Donald Trump was furious about the success of the BRICS summit, and he was very angry in particular at Lula. And while the BRICS summit was being held, Trump threatened to impose 10% tariffs on all BRICS countries. Soon after, Trump then threatened to impose 50% tariffs on Brazil in particular. Politico published an article citing Trump sources very close to the US president that reveal that Trump is absolutely furious about the expansion of BRICS and its challenging of the US dollar. A former top US official who served as Trump's special envoy to Latin America during his first term as US president, Mauricio Claver-Carone, told Politico that Trump was already very angry at Brazil's left-wing president Lula da Silva, but he said, quote, BRICS tipped the scale, end quote.
Because BRICS was set up to hurt us. BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir? Or is that
pretty soon.
If they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff just for that one thing. And they won't be a member long.
But the irony is that the more that the US government threatens Brazil and meddles in its internal affairs, the more that the people of Brazil want to move away from the US and align themselves more closely with BRICS and China. In fact, CNN published a poll this July that was done by Bloomberg that found that a plurality of people in Brazil would prefer aligning with BRICS over the United States. So the poll asked people in Brazil, what country or organization do you think that BRICS should ally the closest with? So there could only be one answer, not multiple answers. 38.1% of Brazilians said that they should be aligned most closely with BRICS. Only 31.1% said the United States. 12.9% said China. Now, obviously, China is in BRICS. China is the C in BRICS. So when you combine together BRICS and China, a slight majority, 51% of people in Brazil, said they should ally most closely with BRICS and or China, compared to just 31% for the United States and only 8% for the European Union. So Trump's threats against BRICS and Brazil in particular are actually backfiring and strengthening BRICS and making it more popular in the global south. Trump's threats are also making Lula more popular. And this brings me to the other main reason why Trump is meddling in Brazil's internal affairs, which has to do with Brazil's domestic politics. Lula is a left-wing politician, and Trump hates Lula and the left-wing Workers' Party, which Lula is one of the co-founders of. And in 2026, an election is coming up in Brazil, and Lula has hinted that he's going to be running for re-election, and polls already show that Lula is leading. So Trump is trying to meddle in Brazil's internal affairs to hurt Lula and the left-wing Workers' Party. Trump and his MAGA movement in the US are closely allied with Brazil's far-right former president, Jair Bolsonaro, who was president from 2019 to 2023. Bolsonaro was one of the most pro-US politicians on the planet. Bolsonaro was so extremely pro-US that he would hold rallies in Brazil with the US flag and also the Israeli flag. I have never seen a sitting head of state of a country hold rallies in his country with foreign flags. Bolsonaro was not meeting with US and Israeli officials. He was holding his own domestic rallies with foreign flags, making it clear that in reality, Bolsonaro was not serving the interests of Brazil. He was serving the interests of the US empire, which is where his loyalty really lies. And in 2022, Bolsonaro lost the presidential election against Lula. So he attempted a coup d'etat. Bolsonaro admitted in court that he met with top leaders of the Brazilian military and tried to get their support for launching a coup to prevent Lula and the left, which won the 2022 election, from coming to power. This is called a coup attempt, and it's illegal in every country on earth. On January 8th, 2023, Bolsonaro's far-right supporters launched a violent attack in the Brazilian capital, Brasilia, and they stormed the Brazilian Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace. This was part of the larger coup attempt, and it was directly modeled after January 6th, 2021, when Donald Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C., because Bolsonaro refused to accept the 2022 presidential election results in Brazil, just like how Trump refused to accept the 2020 presidential results. So these events were very similar. And in fact, some major figures from the US far-right movement were also involved in this coup attempt in Brazil, including Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has a far-right global movement that he calls the Movement, very creative. And Bannon is closely allied with Jair Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's supporters in Brazil, who are known as the Bolsonaristas. And one of the major issues that links them together is China. Both the US far-right movement, Trump and the MAGA movement, are extremely anti-China. I mean, so are Democrats. But especially in Brazil, the far-right Bolsonarista movement is very anti-China. Whereas I already talked about how Lula and the left-wing Workers' Party are much more pro-China and pro-BRICS. So when Bolsonaro was campaigning to be president of Brazil in 2018, he constantly attacked China and scapegoated China for everything. And as president, he was pretty anti-China compared to Lula and Dilma Rousseff, the other left-wing Brazilian president. And of course, Trump started the trade war on China in the US. Of course, that was continued by the Democrats and Joe Biden. I'm not saying that the Democrats are pro-peace. They're not. But Trump and the MAGA movement are extremely anti-China. And in fact, Steve Bannon, who was Trump's chief strategist, and Bannon was CEO of Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, Bannon boasted in 2018, he said, quote, "We're at war with China," end quote. So he's proud of the fact that the US is waging war against China, and the Trump movement sees the far-right Bolsonarista movement in Brazil as a key ally in the US new Cold War against China. And as I said, when Bolsonaro was president of Brazil, he was about as pro-US as a politician could possibly be. In fact, when he failed to get the military to support his coup attempt, because he tried to get military support, Bolsonaro admitted that in court, but he failed, and many Brazilian military leaders did not want to overthrow democracy on behalf of this corrupt far-right leader who, as president, had a completely disastrous term. So after his coup attempt failed, what did Bolsonaro do? He fled to the United States, the country he's truly loyal to. He fled to Florida, which is the international capital of the Latin American far right. All of these US-backed far right leaders who try to overthrow democratically elected governments in Latin America, I mean, sometimes they succeed. The US has overthrown dozens of democratically elected left-wing leaders in Latin America. But when they fail, they often flee to Florida, to Miami, because they know that the US government will protect them and they won't face any consequences. In fact, Bolsonaro's son did the exact same thing. So Jair Bolsonaro was the president. His son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, is also a far-right politician, and he was a congressman in Brazil. But he was also involved in the failed coup attempt, and when it fizzled out, he also fled to the United States to avoid legal consequences in Brazil. He's a fugitive from justice. And Jair Bolsonaro, the father, admitted in an interview that his son is now seeking US citizenship. He wants the Trump administration to make him a US citizen so he can get directly involved in US politics. Again, I repeat, the far right in Brazil and in general, the Latin American right wing, I know this region very well. I lived for several years in Latin America. The Latin American right wing is as pro-US as it possibly gets. There's a term in Spanish that is used for them, which is vende patria, which literally means to sell your homeland. Bolsonaro is a great example. Eduardo Bolsonaro, he wants to be a North American. He wants to be a US politician so he can serve the interests directly of the US empire and not just indirectly, which is what he and other right-wing oligarchs in Latin America always do. They serve the interests of US corporations and Wall Street and Silicon Valley and go against the interests of their own countries. And this is why Donald Trump is directly meddling in Brazil's internal affairs to try to support the far-right Bolsonarista movement in Brazil and to hurt left-wing President Lula. This is what links it all together. Of course, the international politics and the domestic politics are deeply linked. And this is part of an attempt by the US empire to impose its hegemony on Brazil, which is the largest country in Latin America. And top US government officials under Trump have been invoking the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine. They treat Latin America as the so-called backyard of the United States and are basically trying to colonize the region to support the interests of US corporations. And this brings me back to Donald Trump's executive order on the 30th of July, in which the White House officially declared that Brazil is a so-called threat to US national security. The Trump White House wrote, quote, Recent policies, practices, and actions of the government of Brazil threaten the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Members of the government of Brazil have taken actions that interfere with the economy of the United States, infringe the free expression rights of United States persons, end quote. I'll talk about this talking point later. This has nothing to do with so-called free speech. This is the ridiculous, cynical talking point that Trump and right-wing politicians in the US are using to try to justify meddling in Brazil's internal affairs, violating Brazil's sovereignty. This is not about free speech. But again, I'll talk about that later. Getting back to this executive order. The Trump White House claimed that the government of Brazil has supposedly taken actions that, quote, violate human rights and undermine the interest the United States has in protecting its citizens and companies, end quote. That part is important. Part of this is because the left-wing Workers' Party government in Brazil has been trying to regulate US big tech corporations, especially Twitter, which is now the personal property of the world's richest billionaire oligarch, Elon Musk, and he, of course, renamed it X. Musk is a close ally of Bolsonaro, and he hates Lula and the Brazilian left wing. And Musk used Twitter to meddle in Brazil's internal affairs, spreading disinformation and propaganda to try to destabilize Lula and support Bolsonaro and the far right. And the Brazilian government has been regulating not only Twitter, but other US big tech corporations. And this has infuriated Washington because the goal of the US government, it's an oligarchy, and what it does is actually serve the interests of large corporations in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, not the interests of average working people. So that's why this language of this executive order is important. He's saying that the Brazilian government is hurting the interests of US companies. Therefore, Brazil is a so-called threat to US so-called national security. And of course, the Trump White House claims that supposedly the Brazilian government is, quote, politically persecuting a former president of Brazil. Now, I already talked about how that's completely absurd. This is not political persecution. This is not lawfare, judicial warfare. This is because Bolsonaro attempted a coup and the coup failed. So now he's facing legal consequences, as everyone in every country on earth would face if they attempted a coup. So in this executive order, the Trump White House announced that it, quote, hereby declares a national emergency with respect to that threat, end quote. And he's talking about Brazil. And Trump announced an additional 40% tariff on Brazil, which is in addition to the previous 10%. So Trump has now hit Brazil with a 50% tariff, which is a blatant form of economic warfare. Trump is weaponizing trade to use it as a political tool to serve his personal political interests and the geopolitical interests of the US empire. Now, Lula hasn't been just sitting on his hands and accepting these blatant US attacks on Brazil's sovereignty. He's been criticizing the US very harshly. He's been very vocal in his criticism of the US empire. Lula has released many statements, including one on Twitter. He said, quote, the interference of the North American government in Brazilian justice is unacceptable, end quote. Lula pointed out that in Brazil, the law applies to all companies. So of course, he's implying that in the US, big corporations are lawless. They do whatever they want. They violate the law, and the US government serves their interests. It doesn't matter. Whereas in Brazil, US corporations have to face regulation, and if they violate Brazilian law, then they will face restrictions, which is exactly what has happened with Twitter, or Elon Musk's personal property X, which he's using as a political weapon to interfere in Brazil's internal affairs. And both Trump and Musk claim that supposedly Lula and the Brazilian government are violating free speech. But this is not about free speech. This is about the Brazilian government defending its sovereignty against US meddling and trying to stop the US from backing far-right dictators who carry out military coups in Latin America. Of course, there's a very long history going back decades of the US government sponsoring far-right coups against democratically elected left-wing leaders in Latin America, including in Guatemala in 1954 against the elected left-wing president Jacobo Arbenz, including Chile in 1973 against the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende, and the CIA put in power the far-right military dictator Augusto Pinochet. And there were so many other US-backed coups in Latin America during the first Cold War. But even after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, these US-backed coups continued. That same year, in 1991, the US backed a coup against Haiti's democratically elected left-wing president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. But he was so popular that he won another presidential election. So a decade later, in 2004, the US backed another coup against Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti. And in that case, the US military occupied Haiti. And then, fast forward just a few years later, in 2009, the US backed a military coup against the democratically elected left-wing president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya. And more recently, you had the US-sponsored coup in Bolivia in 2019 against Bolivia's democratically elected socialist president, Evo Morales. And never forget that after this US-backed coup, someone on Twitter criticized Elon Musk because he had supported the overthrow of Evo Morales in Bolivia. And this person on Twitter accused Musk of supporting the coup in order to get access to Bolivia's lithium, because it has some of the world's largest reserves of lithium that are needed for batteries, especially in electric vehicles produced by Elon Musk's company, Tesla. And you know what Musk's response was? Quote, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," end quote. The US government has also been involved in numerous coups in Brazil, going back to the famous military coup in 1964 that was supported by the US government. And more recently, the US government backed two soft coups, political coups, against the left-wing Workers' Party, including against Lula and his ally Dilma Rousseff, who was previously president of Brazil until she was overthrown in a US-backed judicial coup in 2016. And today, Dilma is president of the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank. So all of these issues are closely related. And then the US backed another political coup in Brazil in 2018 when the presidential election was coming up and Lula was leading in all of the polls against Bolsonaro. But then Lula was imprisoned on fake accusations of corruption by US-backed right-wing judges in Brazil who were allied with Bolsonaro. And they're the ones who put Bolsonaro in power in a US government-backed operation. And then after Lula was released from prison and the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled that the charges against him had been falsified and he was completely pardoned of all of the false accusations of corruption. And then a United Nations Human Rights Committee featuring top experts on international law investigated and concluded that the judicial proceedings, the false charges against Brazil, were a violation of his civil rights and due process and were politically motivated. This is top international experts at the United Nations. It was a complete fraud. It was a political coup, a judicial coup. It was a textbook example of lawfare, of legal warfare to imprison Lula and put Bolsonaro in power. And the US Justice Department and other US government agencies were deeply involved in the entire process. They helped to train and fund some of the Brazilian so-called judges who were involved in the so-called anti-corruption operation known as Operation Car Wash, which was all just a blatant fraud. It was a political coup. This is why Lula himself said that the hand of the United States was on everything that was happening in Brazil. It was a blatant form of imperialism and meddling in Brazil's internal sovereign affairs. And Lula also pointed out the irony that, Trump is attacking Brazil and imposing tariffs on Brazil, but actually the US has a trade surplus with Brazil. So the US exports more to Brazil than Brazil exports to the US. So Trump says he wants to reduce the US current account deficit. That is the US trade deficit with the rest of the world. But he's now hitting Brazil with some of the highest tariffs, and Brazil has a trade deficit with the US. So once again, we see how completely contradictory and absurd Trump's policies are. Moreover, in response to Trump's tariff threats, Lula said, fine, if you're going to hit Brazil with 50% tariffs, we're going to put 50% tariffs on US goods. We can actually respond and defend ourselves. And Lula went even a step further and said, we can survive without trading with the US. We don't need the US. The Brazilian president said, quote, we're going to have to look for other partners to buy our products. Brazil's trade with the US represents 1.7% of its GDP. It's not like we can't survive without the US, end quote. And then Lula doubled down and said, fine, if you're going to threaten us, we're going to accelerate our de-dollarization. Lula said, quote, we are interested in creating a trade currency among other countries. I'm not obligated to buy dollars to conduct trade with Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, Sweden, the European Union, or China. We can trade in our own currencies, end quote. Now, this is what the multipolar world looks like. This is what BRICS is all about. Brazil is standing up to the US empire, the global bully. Trump acts like he's the emperor of planet Earth, and Brazil says, no, we have options. For instance, Brazil can trade more with China. And by the way, China is already the #1 trading partner of Brazil. Over time, Brazil's trade with the United States has become less and less important. And now that Trump is hitting Brazil with 50% tariffs, I mean, Brazil's trade with the US will basically disappear over time, and Brazil will integrate more economically with the global South, which is what the Brazilian left wing and Lula and the Workers' Party want to do anyway. They want to reduce their dependence on the US. So ironically, Trump is actually helping them do that. And I should also point out that Brazil actually has a trade surplus with China. Brazil exports more to China than China exports to Brazil. So now that Trump is going to be cutting off Brazil's trade with the US may have more of a trade deficit because, again, the US has a surplus with Brazil. Brazil has a surplus with China. And Trump always talks about how trade surpluses are good. So he's ending the US trade surplus with Brazil. And I have to emphasize that although Brazil is a special case because it's the largest country in Latin America with the largest economy, at the same time, it's not entirely unique because we've seen a similar trend across Latin America. The majority of countries in Latin America already trade more with China than with the United States. So China is the #1 trading partner of most of the countries in South America. The farther a country in Latin America is from the United States, the more it trades with China. And the closer it is to the US, the more it trades with the US. So Mexico and Central America and Colombia, their largest trading partner is still the US, but Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, they already trade more with China than with the US. And in the years that come, this trend will only continue. So US trade with the region will become less and less important. So Trump's tariffs are only accelerating the move away from US hegemony and toward more and more economic multipolarity. And while the US empire is constantly threatening Latin America and intervening in its internal affairs, China has been busy building infrastructure, helping the region to economically develop and increase its trade with Asia. And in fact, in 2024, a Chinese state-owned company inaugurated a massive new port in Peru on the western Pacific coast of Latin America, which will significantly reduce the transit time of trade between China and Latin America. This is called the Port of Chancay. And in fact, when they opened it, there was a kind of motto in China, which is from Shanghai to Chancay. And now China and Brazil are in talks to build a massive transcontinental railroad connecting Brazil's eastern Atlantic coast over to the Chancay port in Peru on the western Pacific coast. The official BRICS website created by Brazil for its 2025 chair position detailed the new plans to build this transcontinental railroad in Latin America in partnership between Brazil and China. This article at the BRICS website stated, quote, railway investments stand out not only for their numerous benefits, but also for initiating a strategic partnership aimed at fostering cooperation among countries of the global South. The shared goal is development, strengthening the BRICS presence on the continent and amplifying its voice in global affairs. By building bridges and linking regions, BRICS plays a key role in the geopolitical South and continues to solidify its relevance on the world stage. end quote. And this has been really the main theme of Brazil's foreign policy under Lula and the Workers' Party. They're trying to strengthen the unity of the global South, fighting against Western hegemony, US hegemony in particular, and trying to integrate Latin America and the BRICS countries in a more multipolar world. And on the BRICS Brazil 2025 website, they published a diplomatic statement that explained the ideas behind Lula's trips to not only China, but also Russia in May 2025. Lula told China's President Xi Jinping, quote, "Despite the more than 15,000 kilometers that separate us, we have never been closer," end quote. And he, quote, "emphasized BRICS as a key platform for coordinating the global South and building a more balanced, multipolar order," end quote. They talked about deepening trade, political cooperation, technology transfer, investment in renewable energy. And Lula also said that China can help Latin America to unify as a region to resist US intervention and hegemony. Lula said, quote, "It is with China that we will strengthen CELAC," this is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, "a regional bloc that brings together all independent countries from Latin America and the Caribbean to promote the region's political, economic, social, and cultural integration as a space for political collaboration and coordination," end quote. Lula stressed how BRICS is building new geopolitics of inclusion and solidarity. So this is what multipolarity looks like from the position of the global South. Latin America is so tired of the US empire trying to colonize the region, meddling in its internal affairs, backing coups, overthrowing elected leaders, imposing sanctions and tariffs. And more leaders in the region, especially left-wing leaders, are saying we need to seek alternatives. And they're deepening their partnership with not only China, but also with Russia. Because when Lula was traveling to Asia or Eurasia, he also visited Moscow and he met with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And Brazil underscored how they are strengthening the construction of a strategic partnership between Brazil and Russia. And by the way, under Lula's leadership, Brazil has also been working with China to try to mediate an end to the war in Ukraine, which is being fueled by the US-led West, and NATO, which is led by the US. In 2024, Brazil and China together made a peace proposal to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine, which also called for an end to NATO expansion and Western threats against Russia, recognizing that Russia has legitimate security needs as well. And of course, the response of the US-led West was to completely ignore this peace proposal. So this is what the growth in multipolarity looks like. The world is becoming more and more multipolar. And yes, it's a time of chaos and conflict. The US empire is desperate to try to maintain its hegemony. So as is often the case with the German Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Ottoman Empire, when they're in decline, they lash out, they commit horrific crimes, they bully other countries in a desperate attempt to maintain their hegemony. This is what the US empire is doing today. So yes, it is a time of danger and conflict and chaos, but it's also a time with a lot of possibilities. And BRICS is at the heart of these changes, and so is Latin America. So often geopolitical analysts ignore Latin America. They have this imperialist worldview. They treat Latin America as part of the US empire's so-called sphere of influence. But more and more progressive leaders in Latin America, basically all of them from the left, because all the right-wing leaders in Latin America, as I talked about, are all pro-US puppets for the most part. More and more left-wing leaders in Latin America are standing up to the aggression of the US empire and seeking the creation of a more multipolar order in which Latin America is a pole as well. It's not just Eurasia, it's not just China, Russia, Iran, India. Latin America is a major region with a lot of potential, and under the leadership of Lula and the Workers' Party, Brazil has played a role in pushing for this. They're certainly not perfect. I have criticisms of some of their policies, but overall, they are standing up against US hegemony. And this is why Donald Trump has been so aggressive in threatening Brazil and meddling in its internal affairs. And hopefully now you understand a bit more about why this is happening. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.